And so first of all, of course, we have the Ten Commandments, and the first four apply to humanity's duty to God. I think in your book they say the first five. I've shifted the fifth one into the second category. The first four apply to humanity's duty to God. First of all, you shall have no gods before me. Secondly, you shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything. Third, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And fourth, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And then the last six apply to humanity's duty to itself. Honor your father and your mother. Next, you shall not murder. Then you shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. And you shall not covet. Five qualities of the Ten Commandments. First of all, they hold for the Jews a significance similar to that held by the Sermon on the Mount for Christians. Secondly, they are concise but complete. They reflect divine authority, not mere idealism. They possess an eternal quality. Number three, they are closely interrelated. It's virtually impossible to break just one of the commandments at any time. Fourth, they have application to all people, all cultures, all time. They weren't just for the Israelites at that time, but they also apply to us as well. And then lastly, they go beyond the external and the moral aspects of proper conduct. The book brings up an interesting point about Joshua facing an ethical dilemma in conquering Jericho. So you remember Rahab helped them when they came to spy out the land. And they made a promise to her that when they conquered the city, they would preserve her. And so when the city fell to Israel's army, would this man of God honor the agreement between his spies and the prostitute of the city, Rahab? And indeed they did honor their word, and they protected her. So the greatest sermon ever preached is the Sermon on the Mount. And this Sermon on the Mount, there's so much content in there. Of course, we can't go through all of it. But it's been characterized as a sermon primarily to the disciples, but overheard by the crowd, spoken to the church, and overheard by the world. And regarding the Sermon on the Mount, Henley H. Barnett says it's a systematic statement of the main elements of the Christian ethic. So in the Sermon on the Mount, of course, we have the Beatitudes. And the first three Beatitudes focus on the lowly of heart. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, the first one. Secondly is, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And the remarkable concept introduced by the second Beatitude is the mourning over the things that hurt or grieve God, as well as the joy of suffering with Christ. So blessed are they that mourn. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And there's some, in Matthew 5:17, we see a transition from law to grace. And it says this, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. And we also see some ethical dimensions in the disciples' prayer, otherwise known as the Lord's Prayer, in Matthew chapter 6. And first of all, we see that we honor God when we hold His name sacred. Secondly, God's will is to be respected by both people and angels. Third, the debts of others must be forgiven to ensure God's forgiveness of our obligations to Him. And then fourth, the cry of the human heart must always be for guidance away from the snare of the evil one and deliverance from ethical and moral failure. Then, of course, in Matthew 17, we really find the essence of ethical behavior in the Golden Rule, which says, "So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets." And when we look through Paul's teaching, really the central theme of Paul's teaching on Christian ethics is the concept of the flesh, that is the sinful nature, as opposed to the renewed spirit within the believer. And we know that the sinful nature has to suffer the death of the cross so that the joy of spiritual victory can characterize the life of God's child. So now moving past the biblical passages, looking at some of the historical development in early church history of ethics, we see that the handbook of church discipline for the early church was the Didache, or the teaching of the 12 disciples. And so this handbook identified two opposites. There's the way of life, and there is the way of death. And then in the Shepherd of Hermas, which is an early church document, he identified the two moral obligations. There is the duty of the rich to assist the needy, and then there is the duty of the poor to pray for the rich. And the first Christian to deal specifically with ethics was Clement of Alexandria. He was faced with the problem of men coming into the church with Greek learning and philosophical ideas that were not acceptable to the Christian faith. And there was a real problem with early church, with cults, and with heresies coming about. I've encouraged you before in different classes, if you have the opportunity to learn about church history, it really informs our practices today, and it really helps us to be aware of different heresies that are out there. And so some of these are Ebonitism, Gnosticism, just to name a few. Gnosticism would try to deny the humanity of Christ, whereas Ebonitism would try to deny the divinity of Christ. We know that Jesus is both divine and human. John Wesley influenced England's ethical thinking with his influence on holy love. And his thoughts on wealth are exemplified by his views on wealth made it incumbent on the rich to give to the poor. He insisted that we owe society all that we accumulate above our needs and those of our dependents, and that the poor had the right to share the wealth of the rich. And he believed the gospel was for the whole world, a concept of revolution